Thank you very much. Father Bobby Yap, President of the Atty de Manila University. VP Marlu Vilches, our VP for Higher Education. Dr. Zerina Akpedunu, Dean of the School of Social Sciences. Dr. Melay Abaw, Chairman of the Department of Political Science. Dr. Melissa Lau, Director of the University Gender and Development Office. My fellow guest, Member of the Parliament, Froilin Tenorio Mendoza, and my good friend, and one of the most progressive women leaders that I have had the pleasure of working with. In fact, tomorrow, early morning, I'm flying to Basilan to launch additional Angat Buhay programs in her home city. Mayor Siti Jalia Turabin Hataman. Sa inyo pong lahat, magandang umaga. If everything went according to plans, I would not be standing before you today. Iba na naman yung nasa isip nyo, hindi yun yung gusto ko sabihin. In an alternate reality, I would likely still be a practicing lawyer and a development worker. Or perhaps I had become a judge, like my late father. And in that ideal universe, my husband Jesse would still be alive, and politics would continue to be his lane, not mine. There have been many moments in my life as an elected official when I thought it should have been him. It was a sentiment that I carried both in moments of difficulties and in the few but significant victories. If I didn't lose my husband, I would not be here, definitely. This sentiment is hardly new among Filipino women who enter the political sphere. A society continues to prescribe to patriarchal ways of thinking. Men are still very much preferred for leadership roles. This is prevalent too among political dynasties. Men have paved the way for many elected women officials who begin their journey by being introduced as wives, daughters, sisters, mothers, and even aunts of male politicians. Feminist scholars call them bench warmers, fielded in elections to take the place of husbands, fathers, brothers, or even sons who had reached term limits. Often, they are also the last resort, because sons or other men in the family are considered the logical heirs to a political post. Hence, most of the time, women are just there to keep the seat warm, so to speak, until the man can run for the position again. Or as many political families now do, a woman fills one seat of power while other family members secure other elected positions. During my stint in Congress, dun ko nakilala si Mayor Dada. And we have fought so many advocacies together. Kinikwento ko kay Father Bobby kanina na nakita ko how frustrated Mayor Dada was in Congress. Na hindi niya tinapos yung term niya, nag-resign siya. At least ako tinapos ko. Nakayanan lang sikmura ko, si Mayor Dada hindi. So during my stint in Congress, for example, with nearly 300 seats at the House of Representatives, there were only about 79 of us women. Sa term namin ito. And of that already minuscule number, majority belonged to political families. With 75% of the House occupied by political dynasties, some of the women members even served alongside siblings, husbands, and nephews, occupying a seat for a different district. Uso ito. This notion may explain why we have barely moved the needle in growing the ranks of women in our political sphere. While more than half of our registered voters in the last elections were women, data from the Commission on Elections show that only 23.4% of elective positions in 2022 were won by female candidates. That was just over 1 out of 5 compared to over 1 out of 5 seats, a mere 4,019 posts. Too small a crowd compared to over 13,000 positions filled by men across national and local offices. Tracing back farther to previous elections over the past 2 decades, these numbers had barely improved. These realities are unfortunate as we boast of improved conditions and higher rankings on gender parity. Nasabi na ito ni Father Bob kanina. The latest Gender Gap Index, where we rank 16th, points out that the Philippines is among the 13 countries that improved in the political empowerment category, with a considerable increase in the share of women ministers. While there may be competent leaders among these bench warmers, evidence showed that their families' hold on power continues to be their primary motivation. I saw this in play in Congress, for example, as fellow female representatives failed to truly advocate for women because they were still constrained by the agenda set by male allies, bosses, and benefactors. But whether you're a bench warmer or an honest-to-goodness female aspirant for public office, the fact is that we women have to fight doubly hard for our place in the political sphere. It is a cruel paradox. While society tends to give us the short end of the stick, it also holds us to impossibly high and often contradicting standards. This is consistent with cultural dictates, influenced by old ways of thinking, which confined women to supporting roles, primarily to keep house, care for a man, and raise his children. I know these challenges well. From the start of my political career, I had to get used to comments like, kaya lang naman niya nanalo dahil namatayan ng asawa. When I started gaining steam in the vice presidential race in 2016, the attacks intensified. I was framed as a puppet of my party, a ceremonial figurehead, easily swayed by male advisors. A month before the May 2016 elections, then presidential candidate Rodrigo Duterte said that should I lose, he would make me his assistant president because he thought I was really beautiful. At least sinabi niya maganda ako. But as it turned out, these were nothing compared to the 6 years that would follow. Nakita niyo naman, di ba? As our nation's values shifted, bending to the words of a macho leader with autocratic tendencies, standing firm for my principles proved to be very costly, especially because of my gender. I was consistently criticized and told, manahimik ka na lang, whenever I would speak out, whether it was against the spate of killings related to the president's war on drugs and on other consequential policies that Congress was pursuing with his blessing. It was also around this time that malicious claims against me began to escalate. I had been accused of having several fictitious affairs. Ang dami ko daw boyfriend. The rumor that I was pregnant in my 50s ran for 3 years. And even while I was a member of the cabinet, I was constantly portrayed as a puppet actively involved in efforts to unseat the president. Paid influencers turned appointed government officials amplified these accusations to their millions of followers. The microaggressions and gender disinformation reached the most powerful podium as well. At the 2016 commemoration of Super Typhoon Yolanda's landfall in Tacloban City, Leyte, President Duterte teased me about a rumored affair. Then he called my attention to my legs, admitting that he would ogle them whenever we were seated together at cabinet meetings. He made this remark as I sat behind him, sa stage ito, with other cabinet members and local officials, while a crowd composed of mostly Yolanda survivors laughed and cheered. Soon enough, the president would be less than playful with his words. Weeks after that public teasing, I received a text message with instructions from the president for me to desist from attending cabinet meetings. This effectively booted me out as housing secretary. The president was apparently told that I attended a rally calling for his ouster, which was not true at all. But it was consistent with a long-standing accusation that I was involved in alleged attempts to unseat him. That may have seemed like a direct challenge to his authority. From there, his language would become more vicious. On several occasions, he had said that I was weak and unfit to be president, alluding to gendered criticisms that had already been amplified by his allies. He said I was incapable of taking on problems like drugs, criminality, and corruption, reinforcing the belief that my softness made me a terrible leader. Apart from issuing a standard response, I believed at the time that these gendered criticisms were a distraction from the work our office was doing. The attacks, after all, soon became a never-ending rehash of misogynistic and malicious claims. Much of it was incongruent and ridiculous. I thought it best to stay above the fray and focus on the work before me. Then came October 2019. Siguro yung mga teachers dito maalala ito. I had done an interview where we discussed the issue of ninja cops, or those accused of reselling illegal drugs seized during police operations. In that light, I said, the administration should fix the anti-drug campaign because it wasn't working. It caught the president's ire. In response, he issued a dare at a public event, saying, mas bright ka? Sige, ikaw, subukan mo. Ganun na ganun yung kanyang tono. Curiously, in the days that followed, male allies of the president all felt that they had to say something. Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency head Aaron Aquino, a retired police official, did not mince his words, saying in a television interview, "Personally, if you ask me, sa palagay ko, she will fail." Aquino tried to prove his point by saying, because I was a woman, I did not have much knowledge on the drug problem. And because, unlike the president, I was never a prosecutor nor a former mayor. At that time, I thought the dare was so unserious, just another instance of the president blowing a gasket. But then, days after, Malacanang finally released a letter appointing me as co-chair of the Interagency Committee on Anti-Illegal Drugs, or ICAD. This was rather confusing at the beginning because the executive order that created the task force did not provide for such position. The EO only assigned a chairperson, which happened to be the head of PIDEA. This meant I would be sharing the leadership with Director General Aquino. Allies and supporters warned me that it was a trap. My daughters were worried about it also. But while they meant well, I knew what I had to do. I accepted the appointment against the advice of everyone, seeing it as an opportunity to change the direction of the anti-drug campaign. At that point, thousands had already been killed, most deaths justified under the nanlaban narrative. As blood flowed the street corners and alleyways, the drug problem still persisted, while no big-time drug syndicates and suppliers had been put to jail. I thought that through this appointment, we could put a stop to the unnecessary killings and exact accountability from those who perpetuated them. I thought, if we could save even just one life, the sacrifices would be worth it. I immediately got to work, and in the midst of all the tension, I was cautiously optimistic. Director General Aquino, the designated ICAD chair, and the heads of other member agencies were left with no choice but to vow their cooperation. 2 days after my appointment, I called for my first task force meeting, where all the 4 clusters of ICAD briefed me on their roles and initiatives. As I took my place at the head of the table, I was easily the odd one out. Director General Aquino sat beside me. Joining us at the center were Interior Secretary Eduardo Año, who was the former Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, Dangerous Drugs Board Chair Catalino Cuy, a former 2-star police general, and Trade Secretary Ramon Lopez. We were surrounded by officials and personnel who represented the member agencies, and most of them were men too. I laid out my intentions that I had long advocated for a more holistic approach to the drug problem, one that saw it as a health and community concern, that I commended all their efforts and hoped we could work in harmony because there was so much to be done. Then, when we proceeded to the presentations, I listened and I felt a mix of admiration and frustration. I could tell that most of the agencies were also trying their best, but given the fixation on law enforcement, it was clear that the other parts of the campaign needed more support. I intentionally asked more questions on those clusters. We had lengthy discussions regarding the implementation of the Philippine anti-drug strategy, the conflicting statistics on drug dependence, the pain points on rehabilitation efforts, and the need to strengthen collaboration with communities and local governments. The meeting lasted more than 2 hours. I thought it was a very productive exercise, and I even vowed that I would visit the agencies in their offices so we could discuss their concerns more intensively. Director General Aquino and I faced the media right after the meeting, to provide updates. And it was during that press conference that his condescension slipped right through. Nakita ko si Sir Oliver. Nandun ka ba, Sir Oliver, sa OVP noon? Nandun pa yata si Sir Oliver. He was one of my speechwriters when I was Vice President. Nandun pa yata siya. Kaya alam niya yung lahat na nangyari. So he chose, during the press conference, he chose to speak about my unfamiliarity with law enforcement. Ang sabi niya, ang basis niya daw nun, kasi isa lang yung question ko about law enforcement. And, you know, he was saying that he hoped he would learn, he said he hoped that I would learn more in the coming meetings because I did not have the experience in terms of dealing and working with law enforcers. Finally, he said, maybe, Ma'am, I could ask you to join us in one of our operations. Para daw maramdaman ko what it was like for our law enforcers on the ground. At that time, natatawa na ako noon, pero at that time, sinabi ko na lang, sige sir, gustong-gusto ko yan. The press briefing ended there. I no longer tried to explain that I deliberately focused on the other clusters because I thought that the drug war was so enforcement-centric, and that was the root cause of the campaign's failure. Looking back at that moment, I wondered, would he have made the same assumptions if I was a man? Why was it so easy for him to conclude that I was disinterested and uninformed about law enforcement? And why did they feel the need to taunt me before the press? There would be more instances of microaggressions and outright misogyny in the days ahead, as male allies of the president continued to offer their opinions publicly. Like always, rightly or wrongly, I chose to tune out the noise because there was a lot of work to do. I started making my rounds to key member agencies, holding more focused meetings on their efforts and needs. I sat with advocacy groups and secured their commitment to work with us for community-based rehabilitation, and I even visited communities that were notorious for drug infestation. But things unraveled all too soon. I felt it was only a matter of time. The alarms must have sounded off when I started inquiring about high-value targets. The president's male allies were up in arms, demanding to know what business I had to ask for this information. A question I knew they would not bother to ask if I were a man. I believed it was a legitimate matter to discuss. Millions had already surrendered, and thousands had already been killed. But why did it seem like we couldn't curb the supply problem? Later on, when we assessed the data, we found that the administration had only been able to seize less than 1% of drug money and shabu supply, and juxtapose this with the thousands of killings that were happening of small-time drug users and street peddlers. But this was simply dismissed as meddling. Then, in a late-night press conference, the president took back the promise of a cabinet appointment, saying I could not be trusted. Days later, he ordered my removal from the post, so I lasted in ICAD for a record-breaking 18 days. Such attacks would be unrelenting by the time the COVID-19 pandemic hit our shores. Our office's efforts were consistently undermined as the president and his administration fixated on confusing policies which were enforced haphazardly. Duterte allies and trolls alike dismissed our initiatives and suggestions as mere politicking. Imagine, as our staff were providing PPE sets, running free shuttle services for frontliners, providing dormitories, a government official asked the National Bureau of Investigation to investigate us because, allegedly, I was competing with the administration. Tumutulong na nga, hinahanapan pa ng problema. When a series of strong typhoons hit the country in December of 2020, kung naalala niyo yon, yung sunod-sunod na typhoons, President Duterte himself lambasted me over false claims that I was demanding to know where he was. Naalala niyo yung nasa ng presidente? Pinagdudahan na galing sa akin. He threatened me not to compete with him. At some point, he even told me, mamatay ka na. And in another address, he outright claimed that the presidency was not for women. There were events during my vice presidency when I would be introduced as the second most powerful official in the land. Pag ganito yung introduction sa akin, parang napapailing na lang ako at natatawa. How I wish that were true because I could have done more. But instead, I was labeled as enemy number one. And somehow, the gender card was always their weapon of choice to establish why. In the face of difficulties, I decided to own the spaces that were available to me, no matter how small. What sustained me was defiant hope, resilience, resourcefulness, and strive. I believe that I owe these superpowers to the fact that I am a woman. For instance, in both short-lived cabinet appointments, I exerted all possible effort to make meaningful changes, from streamlining government processes for socialized housing to the first comprehensive and in-depth review of the Duterte war against drugs. But as both of these appointments came as a surprise, I had actually prepared for the possibility of serving my entire term without one. With a gift of foresight, my team and I built the anti-poverty program, Angat Buhay, as soon as my term as Vice President started. This became the core of my Vice Presidency, as we chose to look at limitations as opportunities to create new paths. Without allocated funding for programs, we designed Angat Buhay as a model of convergence, tapping into the generosity of the private sector. And because we were relying on the support of private partners, we knew that trust was our most important currency. Blessed with another female superpower, being meticulous and detail-oriented, I led our office in building a culture of excellent, efficient, and empathic service. This included various transparency and accountability measures, from consistently aiming for the highest audit rating, which we achieved for 4 straight years, to securing an ISO certification for quality management systems and streamlining our processes. We also professionalized our ranks, giving employees avenues for self-development and the opportunity for everyone to volunteer for our field visits and community work. Through the power of collaboration, we brought sustainable interventions to communities. We were always among the first to respond during disasters, and we were preferred by groups and individuals that wanted to help. When the pandemic hit our shores, our office stood at the forefront of the country's COVID response, delivering the most comprehensive operations that filled the many gaps in existing initiatives. We were able to do so much because of the trust that we had established from private partners. I believe that female leadership allowed us to maximize this, because our approach was rooted in empathy and a sense of urgency, particularly in the face of crisis. I am proud that we were able to showcase that good governance was possible, even in the midst of many limitations. A message that resonated with more and more Filipinos yearning for genuine, meaningful change. All that I have learned and experienced, especially in those tumultuous years, affirm the truth that we must strengthen our women's political power. According to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, female political leadership has been shown to advance inequality reduction, increased cooperation across party and ethnic lines, and the prioritization of social issues. Moreover, several studies point out the role model effect that inspires more women and girls to take an active part in society because they see female leadership at play. Given the challenges imposed by society and our deeply ingrained biases, I believe that solidarity plays a huge role in building that empowering space. During my vice presidency, our office established the Angat Bayi Women's Political Empowerment Program, together with the University of the Philippines Center for Women and Gender Studies, with support from the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives. Angat Bayi capacitates female local officials through various workshops, including one that guides them to crafting ordinances on key issues that affect women, in order to promote a more gender-responsive form of governance. But the program's long-term thrust is to someday eliminate the barriers to women's participation in the political sphere. Beyond boosting their capabilities, I believe that Angat Bayi's most important gift to these women leaders is the sisterhood that it creates. The fellows are given the opportunity to be mentored by key women leaders in both national and local politics. They are encouraged to create peer circles for more focused and personal discussions on the hurdles that they face. As they navigate various challenges in the political landscape, our fellows are assured that they have a safe space to turn to. The program, until now, continues to provide this sense of belonging. The kinship and bond that ang Atbayi built stands by until this day. As the fellows grow in their respective spaces and influence other women leaders, particularly the young ones. In closing, allow me to share this quote from the late United States Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, herself a woman ahead of her time. And I quote, "Women belong in all places where decisions are being made. It shouldn't be that women are the exception." Close quote. This applies too in the continuous work of safeguarding our democracy. As we fight to restore our nation's spirit in the face of unprecedented challenges, we could use more of Filipino women's superpowers, their insights, their quiet strength and resolve, and their natural resilience. I believe that our nation will bloom when we uplift women. We see glimpses of it in our homes and communities, in different industries, across key sectors, and even among our circle of friends and peers. Filipino women continue to be the heart of our society. If we are to build a nation that is more inclusive and a democracy that can withstand the threats of these times, it is our collective responsibility to ensure that they are empowered to own this space too. So thank you very much for having us today. Mabuhay po kayong lahat.